Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jennifer Byrne, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here because my happy task today is to introduce Geoffrey Robertson, which, let me tell you, is harder than it seems because the sheer breadth of Geoffrey's activities are really quite enough to give you vertigo. It's in fact the very opposite to a journalist's CV, being deep as well as wide, and it takes us into the field of academia, of authorship, of arbitration, for Geoff spent 5 years as a UN judge in Sierra Leone, and of broadcasting via his celebrated hypotheticals. But it is as a human rights advocate in all its many forms that Geoffrey is best known and where he spends the bulk of his time. He has undertaken literally hundreds of death penalty appeals. He has prosecuted the likes of Argentina's General Pinochet and Malawi's Hastings Banda, and defended, to nominate an extremely odd couple, which will give you an idea of his range, both Salman Rushdie and Mike Tyson. He is the founder and head of Doughty Street Chambers in London, which I want to just explain briefly because to say it doesn't mean much. And I think it's interesting for you to know because it's an indication that Geoff doesn't just write about dangerous ideas and he doesn't just defend dangerous ideas, he actually lives them a little bit too. Because these chambers were set up just 10 years ago by a group of lawyers led by Geoff who challenged the tradition that the English bar should operate out of the Inns of Court. So it was the equivalent to a bunch of barristers up at Phillip Street making a breakout. Certainly the profession thought it was a very dangerous idea. And the point is that these chambers are now the largest human rights practice in England, or is it the Commonwealth? Both. With some 100 members and 23 QCs. As for today's much more dramatic dangerous idea that no one is above the law, well, Geoff wrote the textbook on that, his epic Crimes Against Humanity. This is one of the first of many editions, which it's fair to say did change international thinking on what was possible and what needed to be done to bring tyrants and despots to global justice, which now sounds familiar in a sense because we live in a world where someone like Charles Taylor of Liberia could be indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity while still in office, and I'm sure Geoff will tell you more about that. But the fact is, it was only on the 30th of September 1946, Judgment Day at Nuremberg, that the very charge, crime against humanity, came into existence for the first time, which by strange and wonderful happenstance turns out to be the very day that our guest, Geoffrey Robertson, was born. Won't you welcome him?
Well, thank you for that overkind introduction, Jennifer. My very life is, or the length of it, is a measure of the failure to deliver on the great legacy of the judgment at Nuremberg, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. I'm not going to talk about the Pope. I'm all poped out after last night's debate. But as I was coming here, I thought I'd tell you this, that I was flying, I think, over Afghanistan and put on a movie called The Ghost. It's Roman Polanski's latest film. And it's about a Prime Minister of Britain who has to retire and live in America because the International Criminal Court is after him for approving the torture of prisoners in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Well, not sufficiently far-fetched, obviously, to make a Hollywood movie, and of course the irony being that Roman Polanski was himself, in the course of editing, arrested in Switzerland and held for a crime committed some 30 years before. So we have got to the stage where it is possible, there are no time limits for crimes against humanity, there is the command responsibility theory that if you are a leader and you approve, or if you don't punish, even if you disapprove of the crime, if you don't take the opportunity to punish it, then and you turn a blind eye to it, then you can be indicted by an international court, as indeed Charles Taylor and Milosevic and Karadzic have been. So we've got to a stage where it is at least conceivable as a Hollywood plot that a Western leader may have his or her retirement options somewhat circumscribed. I notice that John Howard is confining his lecture tour to universities in America. But I always think that fiction is stranger than truth. And we have a way to go at a time when President Bashir struts the continent of Africa, whether they've signed up to the ICC or not. Last time in Kenya, despite the fact he's been indicted for genocide at Darfur. When we have Colonel Gaddafi, one of the unindicted co-conspirators in the Charles Taylor case, someone who's bombed passenger aircraft before, quite free to travel the world with his 200 female bodyguards and his tent and his camels, and hold forth without any fear of arrest. I think possessing a large supply of oil is the best defense these days to crimes against humanity. And when we have Iran, the leadership of Iran, guilty of the most appalling atrocities in the past, never brought to book, and now within a couple of years of developing a nuclear weapon. And that situation in a few years' time will, I'm afraid, make the current Arab-Israeli conflict look like very small beer indeed. So today's dangerous idea, even though it seems to be on the way sufficiently for Hollywood to make films about it, still has a great deal further to go in the real world. Just how dangerous this idea can be seen from the first time it was actually promulgated, and that was way back in 1649, when the English Parliament, having fought a war against the king, actually passed a law with the word impunity in it. They said that they were trying King Charles I in order that no future king or emperor could tyrannize over the English people and could claim impunity for it. Impunity, the freedom that tyrants must never have to destroy their own people or indeed others. And Charles was put on trial for torture of prisoners of war and other for pillage and crimes of that kind. The court found him guilty and he was executed. 11 years later, his son, Charles II, came back and the king's judges were all disemboweled. They were hung, drawn and quartered, a particularly horrible experience in which one was hung just enough to stay conscious and then cut down, and then you had your bowels ripped out and burnt before your goggling eyes, so you died in your own stench. The worst death that could be envisaged. So a very dangerous idea it was for the king's judges in 1649. The wounds of the Civil War are still fresh, I have to say, in Britain. Stephen Fry, with whom Jennifer disports this evening, tells me of the time when he had dinner with Princess Margaret and was telling her of his ancestor, John Fry, who was one of the judges who passed the death sentence on Charles I. And suddenly he said, I felt a fork stuck in my thigh. And she said, "Ha, got you back." So the Civil War is still fresh. But the king's judges, all went to their deaths with such actual bravery. They all made very fine speeches about the rightness of the cause and the Republic, that there were hundreds of Republicans still in prison. And after they disemboweled the first 10, King Charles II was worried that the people were turning against him. He had a very bright Lord Chancellor who said, well, we can't put any more to death because the people will rise, but we can't keep them in prison because they still had habeas corpus. He said, I know, we'll put them on offshore islands where habeas corpus won't run. And that's what they did, and that was the precedent for Guantanamo Bay. But it was seen as pretty disgraceful even in those days, and in 1679 Parliament passed the Habeas Corpus Act to apply it to offshore islands, and this feature was finally accepted by the US Supreme Court in the case, one of the cases against President Bush. So that was the beginning of the dangerous idea. Very dangerous it was. We spool forward. The King Louis XVI was put on trial. It was not a successful event. Tom Paine, who was one of the delegates, suggested that his life should be spared and he should be sent to Massachusetts, where he might become a Democrat. But Robespierre wouldn't have that, and he was sent to his tumbrilled to the guillotine, and the drummers drowned out his final words. When Napoleon was caught by the British, they didn't put him on trial at all. They sent him to exile in St. Helena. But we had then the rise of human rights, and the idea that those who breached human rights in a major way might be put on trial. We had the French Declaration, the American Declaration, and even today an American president can be impeached, not for bombing Cambodia or for invading Iraq, but for tinkering with an intern. We have, however, not developed, and we don't develop for some time, the idea of human rights as enforceable rights. That was largely because they were based in those days on the concept of natural rights. And Bentham, for the liberals, said this is absurd, natural rights are nonsense, nonsense on stilts. And Marx, for on the other side, said, well, they're bourgeois rights. And between Bentham and Marx, the whole idea of human rights was extinguished in the 19th century. In the 20th century, we come to the First World War, and the first great human rights atrocity of modern times, the genocide on the day, which began the day the Anzacs landed in the Dardanelles and the young Turks went to destroy the Armenian people, and 1.5 million of them were killed. There was no, and that was, as a result, an international conference in 1915 first uttered the phrase, a crime against humanity. This was a crime against humanity that was going to be punished at the end of the war. It wasn't punished at the end of the war. Some young Turks were taken to Malta. The British couldn't work out a way of trying them for a crime against their own people over whom they had political sway. There was no law against genocide at the time. And of course, Hitler on the borders of Poland in 1939, urging his generals to show no mercy, said, "Who now remembers the Armenians?" Well, strangely enough, and it's an amazing story, but a man called Raphael Lemkin, a sort of slightly deranged Jewish law professor, had developed this idea of genocide as a crime against humanity based on the Armenians in the 1930s. And of course, after the war, he had more grist to the mill with the Holocaust. But he went round the international conferences in the 1940s, bothering everyone with this idea of genocide. And the Canadian ambassador put up with him for an evening and said, "I can't stand this anymore. There's a guy over the road at the Australian embassy called Everett, and I think you'd get on." And he did, and Lemkin and Everett got together and drafted what became, under Dr. Everett's presidency of the United Nations, the Genocide Convention, the first international convention that obliged states to take action when races or groups were being wiped out. And the Genocide Convention is still the basic law that we have that does accept or does take the proposition that no one is above it. It's a very important convention because America doesn't generally sign or ratify conventions, but in 1984, Ronald Reagan decided to, or was taken to Bitburg Cemetery, and that was where, of course, a number of SS soldiers were buried, and there was a young obese protester in the middle of America who, on reading this, jumped on a plane with a friend and a banner that was condemning Reagan for visiting and honoring the graves of SS victims. And the story went around the world in order, the Jewish lobby in America were furious, in order to appease them. 3 weeks later, Ronald Reagan ratified the Genocide Convention, and the young, obese protester from Flint, Michigan, was none other than Michael Moore, making his first and most effective protest. That's how we got the Genocide Convention, but we didn't get quite the idea that you could be above the law for crimes against humanity. The Kaiser, at the end of the First World War, should have been indicted for unrestricted submarine warfare, for the invasion of Belgium. But Woodrow Wilson thought that because he was head of state, the Americans said he's got head of state immunity. So he went off to Holland and died, lived happily ever after, and was not brought to book for the war crimes that he undoubtedly committed. And there is no reference to human rights in this period, in the period between the wars. It's quite extraordinary that Bentham and Marx had killed off natural rights. Human rights do not come into the picture until 1938, when H.G. Wells, Viscount Sankey, J.B. Priestley, even A.A. Milne was part of the team. He used to motor up from Pooh Corner to add to the draft of the first universal, enforceable convention making human rights enforceable. And H.G. Wells, who was the chairman, wrote a Penguin special, The New World Order, demanding that human rights be enforceable. It was translated into 30 languages. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies just on the cusp of the Second World War. The Foreign Office got so excited they translated it into German and dropped it on the Nazi tanks as they were crossing France. They didn't stop to read it, but President Roosevelt did, and it inspired his Four Freedoms speech and the Atlantic Charter, which was the Second World War was a fight for human rights. But at the end of that war, there was a great debate over what should be done with the Nazi leaders. Should they be put on trial? Winston Churchill was totally opposed to this. He wanted them shot on, given 72 hours, time to say their prayers, and then shot. He drew up a list of 75 Nazi leaders who would be shot in that process. And it was Truman and his Justice Jackson who said, "This won't sit on the American conscience with pride. It won't be remembered by our grandchildren. We do need to give them a trial as fairly as the process, as due process would allow." So there was a complete deadlock between the British and the Americans, broken, of course, by the third party, which was Joe Stalin, who loved show trials as long as everyone got shot at the end. And so that is how we got the trial at Nuremberg. And it's very interesting today to look at those old newsreels. Goering, who was the leader, although Dönitz had been a head of state and he was one of the defendants, Goering was the effective leader. He got them all together and he said, "Listen, we're going to defy this kangaroo court." He didn't use that phrase. I don't know why anyone calls a kangaroo court. This lovable marsupial has somehow got itself mixed up with the notion of injustice. But Goering said, we're going to say just 3 words to these judges, which was an extract from one of Goethe's heroes, which meant loosely, "Kiss my ass." And that was what they were going to say to the court. But as the process developed and they realized they were going to get a fairish trial, certainly fairer than any trial the Nazis had ever given their people, they played along. And it's really nostalgia today for someone who's been a presiding judge in a war crimes court to watch those old newsreels of Goering going up to be asked whether to plead guilty or not guilty, and with a great sheaf of notes, and he's about to launch forth on a marathon speech, and Geoffrey Lawrence, the presiding judge, says, "Mr. Goering, you will plead either guilty or not guilty." And it was really collapse of stout party. He dropped his notes and pleaded not guilty and went back to the witness box. And this is to the dock. So this is really nostalgic today when we are trying to work out ways of, in fact, requiring defendants, and there's a problem, being the problem with Milosevic and so forth, who simply defy the court and don't play along, don't play the justice game. That's one problem which I think is being solved, and it's interesting that Charles Taylor has acquired the services of a very capable British QC. But at the end of the 40s, under Doc Everett's presidency, we have the great human rights triptych, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have the Genocide Convention, the first enforceable law against heads of state, and we have the Geneva Conventions for prisoners of war. So we have the basis for international law. And Everett, of course, it's wonderful to read the time when Australia stood so tall in the world. The New York Times had an editorial saying Dr. Everett speaks for all the middle-ranking and lesser countries of the world. It was Everett's dream that there would be an international criminal court, and that was the dream that he unveiled in San Francisco in 1945, and which took so long to come to pass. But then, of course, we have the Cold War, and the dream of Nuremberg and of the triptych really goes into the deep freeze of the Cold War, and we get lots of conventions. We get conventions against racism and against apartheid, against torture, against the maltreatment of women and children, the good conventions. There's someone surveying, I think, the killing fields of Rwanda said that the road to hell is paved with good conventions. It was really, nothing was done. I mean, you had Bangladesh, a terrible event in genocide in 1971. Australian doctors went over and conducted, someone said 70,000 abortions of Bangladeshi women who'd been raped by Pakistani soldiers. It was a period for which no one has ever been held responsible, although the Bangladeshis are trying today to indict a couple of people who were complicit in that massive atrocity. There was Pinochet, there was Idi Amin. I remember when I joined Amnesty International in the early 70s, my job was to write the most groveling, begging letters to General Pinochet. And I remember when I wrote to Idi Amin, you had to begin, "Dear Your Excellency, Idi Amin Dada, QC, VC, DSO and Bar." He'd awarded himself all these things. "Would Your Excellency consider holding an inquest into the 3 Court of Appeal judges who were found floating upside down last week outside Kampala after delivering a judgment, which I could very well understand Your Excellency might have taken exception to." This is the sort of thing you had to do. You had to write these groveling letters. And, of course, it took 30 years before I was able to act for Human Rights Watch in the case that detained General Pinochet for some time in Britain. He'd come to have tea with Mrs. Thatcher, or whiskey with Mrs. Thatcher, actually, and he was detained or put under house arrest, or at least mansion arrest, for 18 months. And one used to debate with all sorts of Tories who would say, "This is going to destroy Chile's fragile democracy. Of course, it did no such thing. Pinochet was disgraced, particularly after they found so much money he'd stashed away in Riggs Bank, and he was supplanted as president by a woman who was indeed one of his own torture victims and whose father had been killed by Pinochet. So there was gradually, I think the Pinochet principle at the end of the 20th century was the first realization. It made people realize, even John Howard said they didn't teach me this at Sydney Law School, but it did make people realize. The Pope objected. Cardinal Ratzinger issued a most furious attack on Britain for detaining General Pinochet. My favorite, of course, was the objection from Fidel Castro, who said this was a disgrace to the honor of Latin American leaders. Seriously. But that really woke people up. But we still had the fact that the Genocide Convention, the developing law against crimes against humanity, had not been taken seriously. The Halebja in 1988, the gassing to death of 7,000 Kurds, was not treated as genocide. A few months later, Donald Rumsfeld was in Baghdad doing oil deals with Saddam. In 1988, at the end of the Iraq-Iran war, a most appalling atrocity took place. I've done an inquiry into it recently for a Washington think tank, and it was a case where 7,000 prisoners, political prisoners, mainly atheists actually, were asked one question: do you believe in God, the God of Ayatollah Khomeini? If they evinced doubt, they were rushed out into the nearest assembly hall and hanged. They were hanged 6 at a time from the walls of that hall. 7,000 within a couple of months were destroyed as Moharib, enemies of God. And today still, the people who did that most wicked deed, and I think it ranks with the death marches at the end of the Japanese War, the Samarkand death marches in which 1,300 Australians were marched to death, as really the worst single atrocity. It was worse really than Sarajevo, or Srebrenica. But the people who did it were Rafsanjani, were Ali Khamenei, who's now the supreme leader, these people don't die. They live to 90s and onwards. They are still the judges and the public figures and the ministers in Iran. And this country, with its enemies, largely destroyed by incredibly inane Bush policy of destroying Iraq and fighting the Taliban, who are the enemies of Iran. Iran will bestride the Middle East with, in 2 to 3 years, nuclear weapons. So what to do about those who commit crimes against humanity and the world turns the other way? The UN had an investigation which didn't finish, and that was the end of that.